Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of the thrilling new series that I'm sure will be sweeping the nation, or at least possibly serve as a good, quick, and easy, convenient solution to insomnia, by the droning of my voice, is discussions, or I should say a monologue, not diatribe, monologue concerning the history of Salisbury, Massachusetts, which delivered, coming to you from the lovely and scenic and well taken care of and manicured Montbury Park in Lake Forest, California, which at the moment there is not a soul to be seen in other than myself, which is very nice, which is actually very suitable, very, suitable for the purposes of this video to present this kind of information. It'd be kind of odd to be recording it, I think, in the daylight with people watching and listening, and then just for, for privacy's sake, it's an ideal location and a time of day, evening, when it would be a bit more convenient for me to do so. So I'm returning to the history of Salisbury, Massachusetts, returning to where I left off, or to add more information, to add more facts. And I don't want them to appear just random, disjointed facts, but some things that I had remembered or recalled that are fairly interesting. That I don't know some of you out there may or may not be aware of, is that and going chronologically, in the early 1500s, there were explorers, I believe their surnames were Gomez, and the Corte de Real or Corte Real brothers, who were Spanish explorers, navigators, who sailed along the coast of what is today the state of Maine and Massachusetts. And this does connect to Salisbury in the sense that one of those two expeditions, one of those two expeditionary parties, you could say, or had entered the mouth of the Merrimack River, which, once again, as I had mentioned the last time, is just to the south of Salisbury, Massachusetts, and flows past it. And pardon my unsteady hand here, which I'm not accustomed to doing, to filming these sorts of videos, which to me, for the longest time, seemed to be a bit of a touch of vanity to be filming these kind of things, and I never have, and I'm haven't kept up with a lot of the trends, to be quite honest. I mean, I'm 44 years old, and this is the first time I've ever done it, but I'm doing it more to convey to share the history as kind of in a storytelling fashion than anything else. But anyway, be that as it may, returning to the story, returning to the narrative, so the Corte de Real or Gomez expeditions, if I can call it that, that's actually wouldn't be the correct terminology, but had sailed into the mouth of the Merrimack River and had, I don't know exactly how far, maybe 10, 15, 20 miles into possibly that far, but probably less, into the Merrimack River. And that's very interesting because they were Spaniards, they were Catholic. These were not Englishmen, these were not Dutch, these were not even the French. And then moving ahead in history, although I don't know if he had actually sailed into the mouth of the Merrimack River, I do know Samuel de Champlain, the French explorer, founder of Quebec, of New France. I do know he had been the first European to sail into and explore Boston Harbor, what is today Boston Harbor, Gloucester Harbor of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which some of you may be familiar with from the film The Perfect Storm. And he had also did explore and sail along and chart the coastline of what is today Cape Cod, or what is today named Cape Cod. And I believe he did pass by Salisbury as well. I can state with 100% assurance, and that it is 100% accurate, that John Smith of Jamestown fame, as you might say, who you'd be familiar with, some of you, with the story of Jamestown from films like, oh, pardon me, what is it called? The New World, that the actor Colin Farrell had performed and acted in. As well as there was a series on PBS, a British and English UK series, it's now off the air, but titled Jamestown just a few years ago. Anyway, so he had sailed along the coast of from Jamestown, from Virginia, further up the coast of North America, and he became the European who named the region what is today New England. New England. He's the one who dubbed it with that, or bestowed that title upon it. And he's also, along with King Charles of John Smith's time period, named the Charles River in Boston. It was not the Pilgrims or the Puritans who founded Boston and Salem. It was John Smith. And I do know he anchored his ship during that voyage off of what is today known as Black Rocks in Salisbury, Massachusetts. Of course, then, he continued on up the coast of Maine, and I believe he named New England New England because he felt that the coastline of what is today New England resembled the white cliffs of Dover in England, along the coast of England, I believe. And just as a side note, Salisbury, Massachusetts takes its name. The person who had named it, a man named Christopher Batt, who was one of the earliest founding colonists of Salisbury, and who was a captain, I believe, of the militia, and was key in the development of that settlement, was from, I believe, Salisbury, Wiltshire, England, and that is where the Salisbury Cathedral, which is famous in England, in English history, is located, and then also where Stonehenge, the Salisbury Plains, are located in England. That's what Salisbury, Massachusetts, or the community in England that Salisbury, Massachusetts is named for. Moving ahead from there, the first floating bridge in what would later become the continental United States, or in all of North America possibly, was laid out, constructed, used by travelers, pedestrians, if you will, in Salisbury, Massachusetts, and it was constructed by a man named George Carr, who Carr's Island and later took the name, of course, of Carr's Ferry, and today there's Carr's Island, I believe it's still called, along the south coast, if you will, of Salisbury, along the Merrimack River. And it was a ferry that was begun in the 1650s and continued on in the following generations of his family, I believe, into the 1800s, into the 19th century. So from the 1650s to the middle, possibly, of the 19th century, which is a good, just about 200-year span. And so it was the first floating bridge in America. And it's actually talked about amongst the history pages, if you will, I think it's the official website of the Salem Witch Museum, which is quite famous throughout the world and throughout the United States. Carr's Ferry and George Carr are talked about. And the Carr family was also involved in the Salem witch trials, and there were members of the Carr family who had accused a woman named Bradbury of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. And I believe someone's coming, so I'm not the only one, but be that as it may, I was leaving off, or I left off, was there's a woman named Bradbury, I think it was Mary Bradbury, who had been accused during the Salem witch trials, and she was accused by members of the Carr family, of George Carr, is his line, who founded the first floating bridge in America. And also that first floating bridge took Puritan settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to what was then known at that time as the Eastern Frontier, which was Maine, because, viewing a map today, and even at that time period too, Maine extends further out eastward into the Atlantic, further eastward than Massachusetts does, so Maine was known as the Eastern Frontier. And so Carr's Ferry brought Puritan settlers, across the Merrimack River, so that they could go further east up into Maine, but at that time was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just as New Hampshire was for a while. And I had forgotten to mention, or although possibly I didn't, that the Corte de Real and Gomez explorations that entered the Merrimack River, just adjacent to, bordering that Salisbury is located near, that was in the early 1500s, which is fascinating that the Catholic Spaniards, had explored that region of Maine, Merrimack River, Salisbury, Massachusetts in the early 1500s. Very interesting. I actually didn't know that myself until just the past few or couple of years or so. That was very interesting to learn that. So moving ahead on the chronological timeline, let me see here. Well, something that I actually wasn't aware of growing up, but that I have a genealogical family connection to, that through a French-Canadian part of my family tree, and through an English captive from Maine, which was part of Massachusetts in the 1680s, who was brought to Canada. That particular ancestor of mine is connected to Daniel Webster, who was a famous politician, American politician in the decades, the 20 or 30 years preceding the American Civil War, which would be known as the antebellum period. Daniel Webster's father and mother, Ebenezer Webster and Abigail Eastman, met, courted, and later married in Salisbury, Massachusetts, and I am connected to him through Daniel's father, Ebenezer, who also had served in the fairly well-known amongst history buffs, the Rogers Rangers, in the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, and the French and Indian War, as it was known in North America and the 13 colonies and New France, Canada. So they courted, and were married in Salisbury, Massachusetts. The newspaper editor, quite famous newspaper editor in the pre-Civil War and America and Civil War years, Horace Greeley, his family also have roots, the Greeley family, in Salisbury, Massachusetts, and Horace Greeley, had been from New Hampshire before relocating to New York City and becoming the famous editor there. Let me see here. Salisbury was also known for, in the early to mid to late 19th century, for events known as great gatherings, and people, such notables of the period, such as the abolitionist Wendell Phillips and other abolitionists, the 19th century politician Caleb Cushing, who was born and raised in Salisbury, Massachusetts, and which Salisbury Beach, before it was officially known as Salisbury Beach, or had been known briefly as Cushing Beach. He had attended these great gatherings where, speeches would be given, food would be served, and there's a photo that's in a book titled Images of America, Salisbury Beach, which was taken, a photo that was taken in 1861 at the opening of the American Civil War, which showing women in their hoop skirts and men with their top hats and frock coats and so forth in 1861 at the start of the Civil War on Salisbury Beach. And following the American Civil War, the committee that oversaw the yearly great gatherings had intended to invite Robert E. Lee, the leader of the most prominent army, or most famous army of the defeated Confederacy, to Salisbury, to one of the great gatherings. But because he had at that point become the head of what became known as Washington and Lee University, I believe, in Virginia, he declined or was not able to attend. But fascinating nonetheless. And also there's something known to this day as something known as a structure known as Butler's Toothpick, or Ben Butler's Toothpick, in Salisbury, Massachusetts, along the Merrimack River, in that area, and also very close to the Atlantic, at what is known as, what I had mentioned earlier, Black Rocks, where John Smith had anchored and it had been placed there. Well, I suppose through the efforts of Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was a general during the American Civil War. I think he might have been an attorney as well, and then he was a politician in Massachusetts in the decades immediately following the American Civil War. And he had also been known as the Beast, or Beast Butler, or Spoons, in New Orleans during the Union, Northern, Federal Union Yankee occupation of New Orleans during the American Civil War. And he had what became known as Butler's toothpick, this placed, and it has like a stone base, just to describe it a bit, and wooden, and on top of it a wooden structure coming to a point, hence like the colloquial kind of nickname of the toothpick, as if it were the point of a toothpick. He had through his efforts, it was placed there to guide ships into the Merrimack River, to Newburyport specifically, and to Salisbury too. Salisbury had shipyards and etc. there, and so that's also another fascinating thing there. Now, to use a colloquial expression that I wouldn't normally use, that not one of my favorite expressions, but to switch gears, bring up something that might interest some of you, is that Hollywood. There are some few Hollywood connections to Salisbury and Salisbury, Massachusetts, that I can recall in the year 2000, and I'm 44 now, and I was 19 at the time, that there was a low-budget film, the director of which had played the character of Flounder in the film Animal House, and the actors who acted in it were Maureen McCormick of the Brady Bunch and Christopher Atkins of the film The Blue Lagoon, and I acted as a background actor in a scene that they filmed. The title of the movie was Title to Murder, and some of you might be able to find that, and it was filmed there at Salisbury Beach, or part of it, and some of the other parts of it in the town, further in town in Salisbury. And now I wasn't present for these following two filmings, but if some of you would recall, and I'm pretty confident that you would, the first film of the series of films that Denzel Washington acted in, titled or called the Equalizer, which was a modern reimagining of the Equalizer, Edward Woodward, who had acted in an Equalizer series from years ago, from the 1980s, which I remember as a little boy. Excuse me. The scene in the first Equalizer film that Denzel Washington had acted in, there was a scene where he's shown standing near a shoreline, and that was filmed in Salisbury. Now, I wasn't present for that, but my mother at the time, and I was in California at that point, my mother sent me photos of Denzel Washington walking in the distance during the filming of it. And then I have seen that movie, really very much enjoyed that movie, and the second movie in the series too. And there was also a movie which was once again I was leading into saying that I haven't seen before, is that a film titled I Feel Pretty, I think, with the actress Amy Schumer had acted in it, that was also filmed based upon my research, what I had read on Salisbury Beach. So, and to wrap up, which some things that I found particularly fascinating as far as regarding the far earlier Native American history of Salisbury, Massachusetts, and some of this I'd learned only within the past 2 to 3 years, is that some of the major roads in Salisbury had originally been or were laid out upon Native American trails that might have been in use for hundreds or possibly a few thousand, a couple thousand years. I'm not sure. Salisbury is also it was also known for, became famous through an author named and researcher named Jeffries Wyman, who he had investigated and done archaeological work on Native American shell mounds along the marsh near what is called Rings Island in Salisbury, and there were apparently hundreds of Native American arrowheads, or projectile points as they're also known, there, and also along the southern end of Salisbury Beach. As well as, and this is probably the most fascinating one, is there were, I believe it was 7,000-year-old Native American remains found along Sweet Apple Tree Lane in Salisbury, and that's actually, interestingly enough, where Daniel Webster's parents had courted. And there were later in the 1970s, to come back to the topic at hand, there were 7,000-year-old Native American remains found. And having dug down, and having discovered them, and having uncovered them, they were seen and were observed to have been positioned in the, or laid out in the fetal position, and there was a red ochre or red powder that had been sprinkled in the graves, hence, and which then, led to the not official but unofficial kind of title for them, or name for them, as the Red Paint People. And I apologize too for possibly droning on a bit here, but it is getting a little bit nippy out here as well. You could probably see my breath as well. But once again, be that as it may, that was quite fascinating. And in early 2023, I had the opportunity to drive down Sweet Apple Tree Lane, and of course I didn't see the archaeological site, which had been covered over, of course, and it's actually, I believe it's a protected spot to this day, and there's a certain archaeological or historical organization that protects it to this day. And actually, this information connects to my own life, is that my father in the 1980s had found a projectile point or arrowhead on the southern end of Salisbury Beach, not very far from where I grew up. And my folks and I, who I was visiting in early 2023, and I was in Salisbury, Massachusetts, brought it to an archaeological team in Dover, New Hampshire, and they determined it to be 3,700 years old. And this man, I believe he was an archaeologist, Jeffries Wyman, in the late 19th century, who had written books about this, found arrowheads like that on the southern end of Salisbury Beach as well. So apparently my father ended up finding one of those much later than Jeffries Wyman, who had done so in the American Civil War period into the late 19th century, and my father then, of course, found his in the 1980s. And just a fascinating story, and also another little connection to my family, as I was talking about, of course, earlier, George Carr, the founder of the first floating bridge and ferry in the United States for the Puritans who were going to the eastern frontier. I actually do own a American Civil War letter written by a American Civil War infantryman from Salisbury, Massachusetts, who had worked as a shoemaker in Salisbury in the years prior to the American Civil War, named George Washington Carr. And he served in the 40th New York, 2 companies of which were recruited in the Salisbury and Newburyport, Massachusetts area. And he was one of those soldiers, and he's a direct descendant of, interestingly enough, of course, the other earlier George Carr. So 2 George Carrs, and even though the one that served the American Civil War, of course, was George Washington Carr, it's still an interesting irony. An interesting irony to note that man who founded the first floating bridge in America in Salisbury, Massachusetts, that settlement, and his descendant later served in the Civil War, whose letter I own, was also George Carr. Interesting. So, well, everyone out there, who may or may not have been put to sleep by all this, and if you were, that's certainly all right with me. That will be about it for tonight, and it was very nice to present all this to you in kind of a storytelling fashion, and I hope it sparked some interest, and that maybe some of you will pay a visit take a trip to Massachusetts and stop by Salisbury and my old neck of the woods, which I'll be visiting in April, although I am quite happy to be a resident of Southern California now, which I do love, and am going to be doing my best to present some of the interesting historical connections between Massachusetts and the East Coast and the West Coast, which a lot of you probably already know about. Some very interesting ones, and even in Salisbury. Actually, one more interesting random fact is that there was a man in what I brought up earlier of Rings Island in Salisbury, that particular district or area close to the Merrimack River in Salisbury, who had built his house, which still stands there, with money, how would I say it? Well, he had, in essence, he had found gold. He had gone to California during the gold rush and had become somewhat wealthy, I think, and and which led to him constructing, or was enabled him to construct a house, a pretty nice one, which is which is historic and is still standing in Rings Island. And there's also in Newburyport, Massachusetts, just south of Salisbury, there is a California street or road in the near the downtown, I believe, and which I'm pretty sure also has a connection to the gold rush in California. But anyway, I'll return to those subjects in future videos, but for right now it's getting a bit nippy. Ironically, of course, these past couple of days have been raining here, and as it does in Southern California in the winter. Rainy and chilly, and kind of reminds me of not winter weather in Salisbury, Massachusetts, where there would be snow, but spring weather of like April, early May in Massachusetts is very rainy, overcast, and cold, just like it is here in winter right now in Lake Forest, California. So anyway, on that note, on that last thought, I will close for the evening, and I wish you all well. All right, bye.